All right, for this video, I'm just going to give an overview of where we've been, a little summary. Starting with the process. Remember, we start with defining the problem. Best to do this from the client's perspective if we can. So a lot of you have been doing your own projects, but you've been doing labs as well, where I've provided you with problems. Of course, the problems I give you are more detailed than what you get from a client. Usually I have to spend a lot more time with a client figuring out what it is they need. Now, when I say client, that could be your supervisor at a park or refuge, or it could be someone that you're getting a contract from if you're in like a nonprofit or a consulting agency. You want to research natural history to find out type of modeling that might be appropriate, type of covariates, collect field data and other data, quality data, I think that should say qualify the data, select the models you want to use, validate the model, characterize the uncertainty, and then when you go to document it, make sure that you document it and present it with caveats, so what the issues might be. Okay. All right, so different things to consider is what you're, when you're doing modeling, is the spatial extent, local to global, temporal, narrow to long time frames. Also, when we go into the past and the future, we have to do special things, especially in the future. Complexity could be relatively simple, like habitat model for one species using Maxent, to really complicated where you're considering lots of species, interactions, life stages, trophic levels, all kinds of things. Can be deterministic, which really means repeatable, or stochastic, that it has some random component to it. Could be predictive or simulation. Most of what we've done is predictive, but we did a little bit of simulation there at the end. So we look at global scope. You're aware there's a lot going on with climate change, sea level rise, the loss of diversity and abundance because of habitat change. Human migration is a huge issue and seems to be getting bigger all the time with what's going on in the Mideast. Resource exploitation is causing a lot of that. Pollution is another big issue. All of these need to be modeled. Usually to model them, we have to work with other people's data. It's really rare that we can get data on these global issues. So we tend to use data that others have collected or multiple people have collected and put together. When you go to do that, those standards and protocols for how the data is collected and managed are really critical, because otherwise when you try to put the data together, they're different and it just won't work, or you'll do modeling and your results really won't be robust. Modeling typically requires larger infrastructure, often banks of computers and months to run these models, and often teams of people working together as opposed to individual. This includes, as I said, climate, pollution, habitat loss, biomass, and species diversity. Climate modeling is something to take a look at when you have a chance. We had a paper which was great. They're called GCMs, Global Climate Models. Largely they model temperature and precipitation. There's also circulation models that look at what's going to happen with air moving, both atmospheric and within the oceans, because those have a big impact on climate. And that's really where we're getting to with these, and you'll see more of this coming out, is where we're looking at what's happening with the global climate and circulation models, what's that predicting for how that's going to impact the global environment. That's going to impact food production, which is then going to be a big factor impacting humans, already is in many parts of the world. As we move down to a regional scope, one of the things to remember is that those impacts from a global scope still have to be taken into account regionally, especially as our climate changes more. Old data isn't going to correlate with regional temperature and precipitation layers. We're going to need to get historical temperature and precipitation and extract covariate values from those for older data. But when we look at just what's going on in the United States or here in California, we're seeing increased importance of wildfires, species shifts, pollution, water scarcity and management, social and economic issues, which we haven't talked a lot about, but I work in periodically, especially security issues, and the immigration and emigration of people and species. Some examples of these are food deserts. This is one that I've worked in. I actually had a student do a park desert map and found out that some of the issues with food deserts, where you have large areas, especially in big cities, tends to be in poorer neighborhoods, that they just don't have as many grocery stores, or they don't have the same quality of food that you see in more wealthy areas. Same thing with parks, same thing with crime density, and there's lots of others, and let's talk about others when we meet. Local scope. So we get down to local scope. Remember, again, we're still going to be impacted by global changes and regional scope changes. So here in Humboldt County, of course, we're being impacted by sea level rise more than most areas because we're sinking, as well as having the sea rise. The good news is we can typically collect field data, right? If we're modeling here in Humboldt County or wherever, somewhere near where you live, you can go out and collect data, which is great because now you know the data. However, be careful, because if you're just collecting data yourself with a small group of people, sometimes you can miss a bias because you're not looking at other data sets and seeing what they're getting. We've had a number of instances where folks were collecting data along roads and didn't realize that the road was biasing the plant distribution because invasive species tend to travel along roads. And so the distribution of species along a road was very different than it was off the road. And of course, it's easier to sample near the roads, so we get lots of data near roads. Working with managers, which I've done a fair bit of, you will hear them ask, where do we spray? They control weeds, invasive species. They need to know where to spray, especially with pressure to not use as much herbicide. Where to burn. Burning is becoming a big issue. Indigenous folks have been burning in this country for thousands of years. We're trying to return back to burning because, one, it doesn't require herbicides, doesn't do as much damage to the landscape, keeps the landscape open for animals, native plants. So that's a huge area of modeling right now. Where to restore or where to plant is a big issue. Where to bring back endemic native species. Where to put marine protected areas. Did a fair bit of work with that up in Oregon. Very interesting work because it not only includes the environmental aspect, but it's heavily based on the economic and social impacts of where we put those MPAs. Where to put marine energy facilities, similar issues. Folks don't necessarily want to be looking at them. And of course, ships need to not run into marine energy facilities. So you get again into the human dimensions of it, which we're seeing more and more. Fish to avoid threatened and endangered species. In other words, where do fishing need to go? Where's the best places to fish? And I'll talk a little bit more next week, or we'll talk a little bit more about this, in that partitioning the ocean world is actually in many ways a much bigger issue than the land, because almost all of the ocean is multi-use. In other words, folks want to use it for energy, they're using it for fishing. The ocean is a nursery for different species. Lots of different things going on in the ocean, often in the same place. So a little different modeling problem than on land, where usually we would partition the land into different areas, some for hunting, some for forestry, etc. We're going to need to move refuges under climate change. That's going to be a huge issue, including migration corridors as species move in different ways than they used to. So these are actually some examples I've had that were some of the more challenging ones. One was just how to make an aging cemetery pay for itself. Up in Oregon, we had a cemetery that went back over 150 years, and it was filling up. And they pay by plots. When you buy a plot for yourself or a loved one, then that pays the cemetery. Once they fill up, they don't have revenue coming in. So how do you make that work? And it was an interesting spatial activity to look at what other ways could the cemetery become a park and other services to folks to keep it going. Do we plant the same species of tree? This happened in Colorado, where they removed most of the trees in the early 1900s and they replanted them with the same species. When all the species reached about 100 years, they all were mature enough that bark beetle could attack the trees, and that caused huge bark beetle outbreaks. So rather than trying to plant the same species, we did some modeling to try and encourage them to do different species. I should say folks in my lab did. Who owns impaired waters? So there's big issues here. When you start to control water, who owns the water? And you may be aware that some of the indigenous tribes here have now declared that the Klamath River is a person, and they're trying to defend it in courts that it has rights to run free, things like that. Kind of cool stuff. But that brings in ownership into our modeling as well. Tied to that are where are water pollutants coming from. If someone owns land next to a river and they drop pollutants into it, well, that pollutant then travels downriver and can affect people downriver. We need to trace it back and then determine, is that illegal? Is it within regulations? What's happening there? And then where are the risky areas to drill for oil? So you may not be aware that you can drill for oil on one person's land and you can actually drill under the person next to you. So sometimes people own mineral rights on a piece of property but not own the land on the surface. And so they come in at an angle. But that's risky because they could still have a spill that might impact an area adjacent to it that's a nature reserve, which we had when I was in Colorado. Now we're also going to see layers on top of layers. So in other words, I'm going to start at the bottom, which is geophysical, and kind of build layers going up. In other words, at the bottom is geology, right? So that's the rocks that we all stand on. And then on that, we often have water bodies, and above that, we have weather and climate. And that's the geophysical world that we all live in. Now, when we model within that, it's typically deterministic. In other words, water tends to flow in a deterministic way. It doesn't have as much randomness as dealing with species. That makes it easier in some ways, but the requirements for accuracy are then expected to be much higher. And also things like geology, hydrology, weather, and climate are still very complicated to model. I mean, they're really responding at the atomic level to what's happening with pressure and temperature changes. And so, yeah, they're still very complicated to model accurately and can require a lot of horsepower. So from there, we can kind of build up and say, well, as you move up the level of complexity for species, we start with bacteria. Their models for bacteria, they're based just on the geophysical environment. Then we have plants, including primitive plants, bryophytes, things like that. Some of these can just be based on geophysical, right? Lichens don't require a lot of other species. But others have relationships, often very complex relationships. Then we move to insects, some of which are fairly simple, some have very complex interactions. Animals, now behavior becomes a factor, and suddenly things become much more challenging to model. And often, if we need to model behavior, we move out of a predictive model into something like scenario modeling or simulation. Then you have parasites and symbiotics. These are some of the most complex things to model, and includes things like COVID, because even though a fungus or a virus or a prion or bacteria are very simple, they can have very complex life cycles and complex interactions with these other species that they're working with. And of course, there are other parasites that I haven't listed here, worms and such, that have very complex life cycles as well and can be really challenging to model with any level of accuracy. As an example, one of my favorites is salmon modeling, which is one that I'm working in. And every time I work with salmon, I find out they're much more complex than I ever would have expected. Topography is the first thing, so that's that geological effect. Salmon can't get over a certain wall height, right? If there's a waterfall, they can't get over it. They're not going to be able to get in. They're not going to be able to spawn there. Cover from wood and trees is important to cool the water and also to keep them from being taken by predators. And gravel beds I'll talk about a little bit. Hydrology then becomes important. BMIs, benthic macroinvertebrates, that's what the juvenile salmon eat as they're moving downriver. That's dependent upon litter, so leaves falling into the river primarily. So in other words, salmon are connected with what's happening with the plants on the shore. And then there's the spawning grounds. And then human interaction, of course, is huge and has caused the decline salmon to where they're 2 to 5% of what they used to be, largely because of human interaction, especially forestry and dams. So when we model it, you start with eggs and alevins, the little baby salmon that have a yolk sac still attached. They need clean gravel, clean cold water with gravel in it, and they actually live in between the gravel until they get big enough, and then they're moving through cold, clear water. If it heats up, they die, and they need BMI to be able to eat and survive. And then they move downriver, and as they do, of course, they have to have enough water to be able to do so. Then they get out in the ocean where we really don't know a lot about. And actually, there's suspicion that one of the reasons salmon haven't come back into those areas that have been restored in any great numbers, which is what we're facing here, is possibly because of the loss of smaller fish that the salmon eat in the ocean. When the salmon come back up, again, they need enough water to be able to get to the spawning grounds, and then they need clear gravel to make redds. A red is a nest or dished out area in the gravel where the salmon they'll actually make the red, and then they drop the eggs down into the gravel. So, makes modeling them a bit challenging. And people are doing pieces of this, and I've helped with some pieces, and I'm looking at doing more of that in the future. So when we bring in humans, things become much more interesting. And this is becoming more important all the time, partly because we're having a massive impact on the planet, either directly by modifying habitats or indirectly by things like climate change, pollution as well, and water diversion, all of these having big impacts, as well as other things. At the same time, we're also looking to study the impact of what's happening in the environment on humans, particularly when it causes loss of life or disease. We're seeing water scarcity become more frequent. Food scarcity is happening as well, and I believe will become the biggest issue in the 2100s. This all ties back to security and happiness. Folks want to have security around food, around safety, around housing, around water, to know that they're going to have these things. And so that's something that we can model to help folks understand the consequences of our actions and how to do better. So working with humans. Humans are not modelers. That's the first thing to remember. So when you go out and you work with others, it's our responsibility to make sure our work is accessible. In other words, we need to be able to explain our work to other people, particularly those that are either funding it or that are going to be impacted by it. Often telling stories is more effective than presentations. Telling them stories about your modeling, about your experience, and about the species and how the species interact with the environment. And maybe doing that first and then doing a presentation. Now, also, whenever you're working with humans, if you're using them as research subjects in any way, you need to be very, very careful and very serious about especially personal data, cultural artifacts, or human remains. There's an ethical obligation here for us to be very careful when we do that and how we manage the data. And there's been researchers in the past that have not done well with that. If you do this with a university, you will be required to go through the Institutional Review Board or the IRB board and have a training on how to do that. Be really careful with that, because not only is it an ethical concern, it's also a legal concern. Working with tribes, I've had a fair amount of experience now working with tribes, both professionally and personally isn't working, but just friends that I've had that were members of tribes. If you haven't worked with tribes, something to know is each tribe is different. Each tribe has its own history, culture, often their own language. Often there are multiple languages in one tribe now because some of the tribes have been combined together because of their population decline in the last century. Also remember that each person within the tribe is also unique, just like we are all unique. So they have their own culture and their own identity as a tribe, but then of course each person also has its own identity, and don't forget that. Also know that indigenous people all over the world have been forced off their land or killed for centuries, including my indigenous people, the Celts within Europe, faced 2,000 years of that. Your indigenous roots may have been through the same thing, probably have at some point. So we want to be sensitive to that, and we want to be careful when we interact with them and make sure that we don't come off looking like we're trying to force them to do something. And they will be wary of that, even though they may not tell you right away. Almost all indigenous folks will be sensitive to that and watching for it. So instead, the thing to do that I was told when I started working with tribes professionally was to focus first on getting to know the tribe and the people, right? Get to know them, spend time with them, make sure that they feel you are welcome there, and then see how they want you to help them. They have their own objectives, their own goals. things they want to do. We may be able to help with that, we may not. So different approach, right? Get to know them, then see what they want. Now this takes more time than traditional approaches when we work with local government, cities and counties and such, and federal agencies. But in my experience, it can be a much more rewarding experience as well. And the results have a better chance of being used. Your efforts will have a better chance of being used and provide a benefit to folks. Tools. Okay, really quick kind of overview of the tools we've talked about. Things to remember. Density is important. Now, density, we wouldn't consider a modeling tool in this class. Some folks consider a model, density to be a model of points. That's fine. We tend to use it as a covariate, right? So remember that you can take points, convert them to raster, now you can use them as a covariate. Density of trees could be used as a covariate for an animal species. Interpolation, converting points to rasters. One to really be aware of, probably the one that we mess up the most with uncertainty because of things like the weather layers that we've talked about. Point to polygon is another one. Some simple algorithms like home range with minimum convex polygon often are better than more complex methods. And you can convert points to polygons and then do other modeling with them. And of course other conversions as well. I'm just hitting a few here. Polyline to point is one that we use with transects. If you've got a transect and there's points along it that they recorded information, often just in a notebook with distances, you can convert those to points and then use those as points with appropriate uncertainty information. Of course, the big one we did was correlation and regression. Everything from linear models to general linear models. Don't forget those because you want to use the simplest one you can. And if you can just transform your covariates or your response variable, you can use a general linear model and you're done. GLMs are general linear models, GAMs, additive models, and then the mixed model versions of those. So kind of increasing in complexity and flexibility with those. And then of course Bayesian, and then other ones. There's a whole bunch of other ones out there. We didn't cover all of them. Neural nets is one that's potentially important for you in the future. CART, I appear to left off of here, the tree modeling as well. And then we didn't spend a lot of time talking about combinations or ensemble modeling. Ensemble modeling is putting together multiple models in different ways. We saw them do that early on with the crab model. So that would be a type of ensemble modeling, and that's becoming more popular as well. Again, more difficult to explain, but important. Okay, now also remember that when we're doing correlation regression, the response variable drives the method, right? So if you have occurrences, all you can do with it is a habitat suitability model, maxent, Hemi, something like that, or some kind of point density thing with it. Presence absence, we're looking at GLMs or logistics, categorical, CARTs, BRTs. I've done some playing with BRTs with the species data for California. CART, I never got it to finish when I tried to do it with more than a few species, and I was able to get a BRT to finish, and then I'm working to see if I can get its complexity down to where I feel comfortable with it. So booster regression trees are interesting there. And you will continue to experiment with models, I hope, in the future, learn about them, and let me know what you find. And then, of course, we have all of our continuous models. As you work on your models and you struggle to find good models, remember to try a wide variety of covariates. DEMS, I'm not a real fan of because on a latitudinal gradient, as you go north, things get colder at lower altitudes. So be careful using a DEM as a proxy for weather, but using it for slope, aspect, those things is great. And there's other proxies, right? When we use something that's remote sensing layer, we might use it for land cover. Well, it's really a proxy, right? Because it's only seeing the top of the canopy. So it's not really getting the land cover, but it's close enough in many situations. And look for those because often you can get something that's a proxy for what you're really looking for, and it's close enough. All right, simulations and visualizations. So when you can't get the data you need to do a regression, you can do simulations, agent-based models, cellular automatons. We talked about agent-based models, played with them. We didn't talk a lot about cellular automatons. I don't see them as often. I think the agent-based model is more useful, but you will see them integrated together. In fact, in our picture here of NetLogo with the animals grazing, the grass in the background is actually a cellular automaton. So it's a grid, and each cell in that is a little automaton, a very simple one, but still it's a combination of cellular automatons and agent-based models, which I think is a very powerful direction to go. And I've seen these used especially for volcanoes. In the past, when we didn't have enough data, we can create simulations on what might have occurred with the volcano to result in the geologic structures and the distribution of things like lava bombs across plains, and to test out hypotheses on how the volcano might have formed and erupted to create a certain set of geologic conditions. So very powerful for things like that. And then of course we can use those simulations to look at predicting potential future scenarios. Also, don't forget remote sensing methods. Just got a reminder from some of my students about these. There's a whole set of remote sensing methods to do modeling. PCA is one, ordination is another, to help understand what's happening in the data. Now, these aren't regression models per se, but they can help you to understand what's happening in a data set, and then you might use the results of one of these as a covariate in a model. Same thing is true of indexes, of course, a whole bunch of remote sensing indexes, and then land cover. And of course, I encourage you to take additional classes in things like remote sensing, programming, and statistics, as well as all the natural resource stuff, to continue to increase your sophistication in your models. Thanks.